Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, or Grand Duchess Olga Romanov, born in 1882, dying in 1960, was one of the last Romanov Grand Duchesses. Escaping to Denmark in 1920, where she lived with her mother, the Dowager Empress, which you can find out about on this channel, Grand Duchess Olga found peace at the Ballerup farm outside Copenhagen. Farming came naturally to her, and she raised cattle, pigs, and vegetables at her and her husband's Danish farm, reflecting the innate connection of the Russian people with the land. Accompanied by Grand Duchess Anastasia's nursemaid, who sewed her jewels inside her petticoats, Grand Duchess Olga was never a big fine item fan, but photographs show her with a love for hats. She continued when meeting Queen Elizabeth II in a blue ensemble in 1959. According to her authorized biography, The Last Grand Duchess, she managed to escape Imperial Russia with an ostrich feather hat. She was one of the few Romanovs permitted to live at Tsarskoye Selo with her brother, Tsar Nicholas II, and his wife, Empress Alix. Her closeness to the Romanov children was reflected in her utter love for Anastasia, whom she called the smartest of the set. You can learn more about Empress Alix's jewelry on this channel. However, Grand Duchess Olga did lament that the Grand Duchesses were not better at horseback riding. Her love for Grand Duchess Anastasia made Grand Duchess Olga the target of impostors, which started with Anna Anderson in 1925 Berlin and continued for the rest of her life. Grand Duchess Olga remained staunch in her belief that the true Grand Duchess Anastasia had died, and when she learned of the 18 bayonet marks in the floor at the mansion of Ekaterinburg, she began to refer to her brother as a martyr. Asked by her biographer Ian Vorez if she prayed for her brother, she replied no, she prayed to him because he is a martyr. The concept of martyrdom is almost wholly Eastern. Yet with the Romanov royal martyrs we get a real European sense of it. This understanding that for nationalism there have been many martyrs the world over. Let's dive into the top 5 jewels of Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna. First is the ostrich feather hat we know Grand Duchess Olga escaped Imperial Russia with. It could have taken the forms of the ostrich feather hats worn by the Grand Duchesses. When looking at the wardrobe of the Grand Duchesses, we see the simplicity and humility encouraged by their devout mother, Empress Alix. But there may be a darker reason. As Grand Duchess Olga remembered, her brother was encouraged by his inept ministers to invest his daughter's personal fortunes in German stocks right before World War I. This seemingly treacherous, bewildering suggestion could not have helped the reputation of the girls, born to a princess of Hesse, in the press. But the stocks almost completely failed as well, wiping out the multi-million ruble personal fortune of the girls from 1914 onwards. Yet it was this hint of German fortune that fortune seekers may have remembered when that first Anastasia impostor appeared on the scene in 1920s Berlin. Second is Grand Duchess Olga's fan. Grand Duchess Olga remembered this fan covered in diamonds and pearls as well as ostrich feathers in her memoir. It could be another fan like this one is shown in the seizure photographs taken by the Zionist Bolsheviks after their raids of the palaces. Third is Grand Duchess Olga's kimono. We know she escaped Russia with it, and it potentially kept her warm on the White Army trains making their way to Crimea and Yalta in 1918. Grand Duchess Olga's niece, Grand Duchess Maria, was photographed in a kimono, and since the family lived together at Tsarskoye Selo, perhaps all the royal females received identical robes. Grand Duchess Olga remembered her niece Maria as potentially having hemophilia as well, since her tonsil surgery involved a great deal of blood. Fourth is the diamond sapphire ring given to Grand Duchess Olga by her mother, the Grand Dowager Empress, in congratulations of the birth of her first son in 1917. The Dowager Empress jealously guarded a jewelry case after the fall of Imperial Russia, and it was valued at £500,000 upon her death in 1928, a huge sum. Unfortunately, its contents were scattered in part by unscrupulous auctioneers and even potentially Grand Duchess Olga's sister, Grand Duchess Xenia. But we know Grand Duchess Olga received a ring and kept it safe in her farmhouse in Canada, where she was exiled after Nazis and Russian factions kept paying her homage in 1940s Denmark. At a small farm in Campbellville, Ontario, the ring was stolen by a farm workman, but he left Grand Duchess Olga's letters and personal papers. One shudders to think where the ring is now, with extreme immigration decimating Canada's national character. Here is the remembrance by Olga herself. 1952 was a bitter time for Olga, a time made even more bitter by the fact that a few months earlier some of her most valuable jewelry had been mysteriously stolen. Of greatest distress to her was the loss of a priceless ring which had a sapphire the size of a cherry, surrounded by tiny bands of diamonds and sapphires. This had been given to her by her mother when her first child, Tikhon, was born. The ring and a few other jewels were in a small box, which was kept in a briefcase along with some important family papers. According to the Grand Duchess, there was no fear that the briefcase would be stolen, since it was always kept in open view beside the colonel's rocking chair, and only the family was aware of its contents. One day, however, the briefcase mysteriously vanished. The police were called, and a careful search was conducted in the house and its grounds. In addition, everybody was interrogated, especially two farm hands then working on the farm. After hours of intensive searching, the empty briefcase was found hidden in the barn. In a bush nearby, the family papers lay littered on the snow. None of the jewels, including the ring, was ever recovered. The police was certain it was an inside job. The irony of it all was that had we entrusted the safekeeping of the jewels to good old Mimka, the theft would never have occurred, said the Grand Duchess. For faithful Mimka, like any cautious Russian peasant, sewed all the jewels of her mistress in the lining of her petticoat, the safest place of all. The unexpected loss of the ring was felt keenly by Olga, who regarded it as yet another sign of the curse that seemed to hang over the Romanov jewels. Fifth is one of the icons given to Grand Duchess Olga, which would come to dominate the walls in her bedroom. By the late 1950s, Grand Duchess Olga went to a jeweler with her 2 or 3 brooches, pendant, bracelets containing diamonds, rubies, and sapphires in old settings. She sold them all, as she needed the money to take care of herself and her sick husband. When asked about it, she stated she did not want to discuss it. This icon appears to be a wedding gift from Princess Alexandra Obolenska, who died in 1943, to the Grand Duchess Olga, who married her first husband, Duke Peter Alexandrovich of Oldenburg, in 1901 at the Gatchina Palace. The Gatchina Palace was where Olga grew up, and she had very fond memories of it. Princess Abelskaya was a close friend of Grand Duchess Olga's mother, as well as being her maid of honor. In this icon, we can reflect on Grand Duchess Olga's faith, as well as her remembrance of a strange Siberian mystic, Rasputin, whom she got to know due to her residence with the imperial family. Here it is. Possibly no other country in the world could have produced such an embodiment of ambiguities and contradictions as Rasputin. No labels really fit him, and to call him a schizophrenic does not explain him. For all the violent extremes met in his nature, he was neither saint nor devil. When blind adulation on one side and frenzied strictures on the other have had their say, the man emerges like a chameleon, whose words and actions changed their color according to the varied needs of the people he met, the environment, and finally his own moods. Religious fervor and fatalism, generosity and selfishness, sagacity and an almost wooden obtuseness, kindness and cruelty, humility and arrogance, the list of opposing qualities could well be carried further. Now a mere plaything of chance, now an architect of events, this man without a surname came out of obscurity at the very moment when the country was sick almost to death, when the Manchurian disasters, coupled with savage lawlessness within her own borders, reduced the nation's hopes to a faint flicker, and when the Emperor and Empress, secluded at Tsarskoye Selo, were in the grip of sharp anxiety about their little son. As has already been said, Grand Duchess Olga was a great intimate at the Alexander Palace. I think she admitted they did appreciate my not prying into their purely personal affairs. I made it a principle never to ask questions or to give uncalled for advice, still less to interfere in their private life. Grand Duchess Olga was at first very reluctant to discuss Rasputin. Rasputin has become the central figure of a story the world has long since accepted as true. Anything I might have to say about him would either fall on deaf ears or be dismissed as a fable. Anything written about the man is so colored and twisted that it is virtually impossible for the public to sift fact from fiction. Not only did I know Nicky and Alicky far too well to believe any of the ugly rumors, but I also knew the Siberiac, literally the man from Siberia, and knew too the limits of his influence at the palace. Volume upon volume has been written about it all, but who among all those authors had access to first-hand information? I can think of two only. Take the memoirs of Paleologue, the French ambassador, as an example. His embassy was just a great social center in St. Petersburg. He boasted of his friendship with Aunt Mishan. His supposed exclusive information concerning my brother, his wife, and Rasputin was no more than a digest of all the tittle-tattle heard in the drawing rooms of St. Petersburg, particularly Aunt Mishan's salon. He did meet the man once or twice, but he had never been to Tsarskoye Selo informally, and audiences are not the occasion for private confidences, but Paleologue chose to set himself up as an authority, and the reading world accepted his claim. This is the picture of the public mind today, that he was an evil genius, created by unbridled imagination, and they started creating the legend in Rasputin's lifetime. I know that what I am going to say will probably disappoint a great many people, always avid for spicy revelations, but I think it is high time the man was reduced to his proper size and standing. He was neither saint nor devil. To Nicky and Alicky he remained what he was, a peasant with a profound faith in God and a gift of healing. There was no mystery whatever about his meetings with the Empress. All those elements were born in the imagination of people who had never met Rasputin at the palace. Someone turned him into a member of the staff. Many others made him a monk or a priest. He had no position either at court or in the church, and apart from his undoubted gift of healing, Rasputin was neither as impressive nor as exciting as people think. He was just a Stranic. A Stranic is literally a lay pilgrim. They wandered from monastery to monastery, from village to village, sometimes curing the sick and begging their bread on the way. Yet Rasputin could not rightly be described as a Stranic. None among them possessed families or homes, but Rasputin had a wife and 3 children, and the Grand Duchess said that in his wandering from place to place he never forgot his family. He was deeply attached to him all. It was in July 1906 that the Emperor recorded the first meeting of Rasputin at a monastery in the neighborhood of Peterhof. In the original, the sentence in Nicholas's diary ends with an exclamation mark. It was October 1906, and Rasputin was summoned to the palace for the first time. He came at 6:30 p.m., he saw the children, and talked to us until 7:15 p.m. So Nicholas wrote in his diary, as Rasputin was a deep friend of John of Kronstadt, and John of Kronstadt was in the audience of the imperial family. It is important to remember that Nicky and Alicky were fully aware of Rasputin's past, the Grand Duchess remembered. It is completely false to suggest that they regarded him as a saint incapable of evil. I say it again, and I have the right to say so. Neither of them had been duped by Rasputin or had the least illusion about him. The unfortunate thing was that the public did not know the truth, and neither Nicky nor Alicky, because of their position, could fight the lies which were being spread. Now let us get it right. First, there were thousands upon thousands of common folk who firmly believed in the man's gift of prayer and healing. Then came the bishops and archbishops. Society, always hungry for the unusual, followed the lead. Finally, Nicky's own cousin accepted the Siberiac and introduced him to my brother and his wife. And when did this happen? In 1906, when the cruel truth about my little nephew's health gave them endless anxiety. I read somewhere that Rasputin was, as it were, smuggled into the palace by Anna Vyrobova, who hoped to increase her own influence by doing so. That is pure rubbish. Anna Vyrobova never had any influence. Many a time did Alicky say to me how sorry she was for that poor Annie. She was utterly irresponsible, childish to silliness, and addicted to hysterical outbursts. She did cling to Rasputin as to an anchor, but she never brought him to Alicky's notice. It is perfectly true that after he had been to the palace a few times, wildly exaggerated reports about his influence at court made many people try to turn him into a tool to further their own ambitions. Rasputin was besieged with petitions, and presents were showered on him, but he never kept anything for his own use. I know he helped the poor of St. Petersburg and elsewhere, and not once did I hear him beg for any favors from Nicky and Alicky. I often heard him make requests for others. I am sure that his attachment to my brother and his wife was utterly devoid of self-interest. He might so easily have amassed a fortune, but he died owning a Bible, some clothes, and a few things given him by the Empress for his personal use. Even the furniture in his flat in St. Petersburg did not belong to him. It is true he received large sums of money, but all of it was given away. He kept just enough to provide food and clothing for his family in Siberia, and if at the very end he became conscious of the political power he could exert, it was only because some ruthless and unscrupulous people forced him into it. I do know that all I have said so far may well seem to turn me into a devotee of Rasputin's, but let me say it straight out, I never liked the man. All the same, the interests of history cannot be served by a false perspective. She vividly remembered the day in the autumn of 1907 when she first met Rasputin at the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo. She was then living in St. Petersburg, but she went to Tsarskoye Selo at least 2 or 3 times a week. On that particular day she was asked to dinner. There was no other guest. When the meal was finished, her brother said, "Will you come and meet a Russian peasant?" She followed the emperor and his wife up a flight of stairs into the children's nurseries. The 4 girls and their little brother, all in white pajamas, were being put to bed by their nurses, and in the middle of the room was Rasputin. When I saw him, I felt that gentleness and warmth radiated from him. All the children seemed to like him. They were completely at their ease with him. I still remember their laughter as little Alexis, deciding he was a rabbit, jumped up and down the room. And then suddenly Rasputin caught the child's hand and led him to his bedroom, and we 3 followed. There was something like a hush, as though we had found ourselves in church. In Alexis' bedroom no lamps were lit. The only light came from the candles burning in front of some beautiful icons. The child stood very still by the side of that giant, whose head was bowed. I knew he was praying. It was all most impressive. I also knew that my little nephew had joined him in prayer. I really cannot describe it, but I was then conscious of the man's utter sincerity. With the children put to bed, the emperor, his wife, and sister returned to the mauve boudoir on the ground floor. Rasputin joined them there. There was some conversation. I realized that both Nicky and Alicky were hoping that I would come to like Rasputin. I was certainly impressed by the scene in the nursery. I allowed the man his sincerity, but I could never bring myself to like him. I was impressed by his eyes, which turned blue and brown in turn and rolled about in a frightening manner, but I did not see any magnetism there. I never felt I was hypnotized by Rasputin. I did not think that his personality had anything irresistible in it. If anything, I found him rather primitive. His voice was very rough and uncouth, and it was almost impossible to keep up a conversation with him. That very first evening I noticed he leapt from one subject to another, and he did use so many biblical quotations. They did not impress me in the least. I knew enough about the peasants to realize that a great many among them knew whole chapters of the Bible by heart. It was his curiosity, unbridled and embarrassing. In Alicky's boudoir, having talked to her and Nicky for a few minutes, Rasputin waited for the servants to get the table for evening tea, and then began plying me with the most impertinent questions. Was I happy? Did I love my husband? Why didn't I have any children? He had no right to ask such questions, nor did I answer them. I am afraid Nicky and Alicky looked rather uncomfortable. I do remember I was relieved at leaving the palace that evening and saying, "Thank God he hasn't followed me to the station," as I boarded my private coach in the train for St. Petersburg. A little later, Rasputin was there at Tsarskoye Selo, and he seemed very pleased to meet me again. And when the hostess, with Nicky and Alicky, left the drawing room for a few moments, Rasputin got up, put his arm about my shoulders, and began stroking my arm. I moved away at once, saying nothing. I just got up and joined the others. I'd had more than enough of the man. I disliked him more than ever. Believe it or not, on my return to St. Petersburg, I did a strange thing. I sought my husband out in the study and told him all that had happened at Anna Vyrabova's cottage. He heard me out and with a grave face suggested that I should avoid meeting Rasputin in the future. For the first and only time, I knew my husband was right. A few weeks later, when the Grand Duchess was alone in her drawing room, Anna Vyrabova was announced. She came in, disheveled, flushed, and excited, and flung herself down on the floor by the Grand Duchess's chair. She had come to ask the Grand Duchess to receive Rasputin in her own house. I remember her repeating, "Oh, please, he wants to see you again so much," and I refused very curtly, and I kept to my refusal. From then on, I only saw Rasputin at Anna Vyrabova's cottage when I accompanied Alicky. Nicky would not have him at the palace again, because of all the spreading slander. To the best of my knowledge, Nicky put up with the man solely on account of the help he gave to Alexis, and that, as I happen to know very well, was genuine enough. Stories were invented by people who had not the slightest personal knowledge either of my brother or of Alicky, and who were equally ignorant of the peasant make-up. In the first place, any untoward behavior would never have been tolerated for an instantly, and secondly, and even most importantly, Rasputin was and always remained a peasant, in whose eyes the Tsar's person was sacred. He was always respectful, although I don't suppose he ever learned anything about etiquette. He always called them Batushka and Matushka, little father and little mother. They always spoke to him and of him as Grigory Efimovitch. On his rare visits to the palace, he came either to prayer for the Tsarevich or to speak on religious themes with Alicky. To judge by some of the absurdities written about him, you would imagine he practically lived at the palace. That whole incident is a complete and most grotesque fabrication. The children never dined with their parents. Nicky and Alicky, except when they had guests, had their dinner served either in the mauve boudoir or in the little drawing room. There was no proper drawing room in their wing at Tsarskoye Selo, and I was too much of a habitué there not to know that Rasputin never had a meal at the palace. People who write that kind of nonsense have not the slightest idea of the way the imperial family lived. And what has been written about my nieces and Rasputin is even worse. I had known those girls since their babyhood. I stood so close to them that they would sometimes confide their little secrets to me, which they felt they couldn't bring to their mother. I know what their upbringing was down to the tiniest detail. The least sign of what is known as freshness on Rasputin's part would have bowled them over. None of it ever happened. The girls were always glad to see him because they knew how greatly he helped their little brother. I do remember hearing in St. Petersburg that my sister-in-law poured money like water on Rasputin. Once again, there was not any foundation to it. Alicky was very careful, as you might say. It would have been utterly out of character for her to throw money about. She gave him shirts and a silk belt she had embroidered, and also a gold cross. There's also the story of the rape of a nursery maid, which reached the emperor, who immediately ordered a thorough investigation. The investigation proved that the girl had been caught in bed, but with a Cossack of the imperial guard. Nor, according to Olga, was there any truth in the story that the Empress was put into trances at spiritualist seances arranged by Rasputin at Anna Vyrabova's cottage. That would be laughable, she said, if it were not wicked. Alicky's piety may well have been exaggerated, but she was staunchly orthodox, and our church bans all such activities. And again, you may remember that in a book written by Catherine Kolb, who had nom de plumes like Princess Catherine Radziwill, that Vyrabova had a key to my sister-in-law's diary and knew all her secrets. Now, Alicky's diary had no lock, and she was never a good diarist. During the last years, she was far too busy and ill and stopped making entries together. Grand Duchess Olga said this, potentially not knowing that Empress Alix kept a diary up until the last day of her life. Grand Duchess Olga admitted she found it difficult to follow Rasputin's thickly slurred Siberian accent. She said, "I felt that their friendship with the man was their private concern, and that even I would not have been justified in interfering. I had plenty of opportunity to do so, since for years I used to see Nicky and Alicky practically every day. But I never did, partly because I could well gauge that Rasputin's reputed influence was non-existent where Nicky was concerned, but mainly because of the Tsarevich Alexis. There is no doubt Rasputin was a healer. I saw those miraculous effects with my own eyes, and that more than once. I also know that the most prominent doctors of the day had to admit it. Professor Fyodorov, who stood at the very peak of the profession and whose patient Alexis was, told me so on more than one occasion, and all the doctors disliked Rasputin immensely. I wonder what Alicky must have thought, and that proved the first crisis out of many. The poor child lay in such pain, dark patches under his eyes, and his little body all distorted, and the leg terribly swollen when he was barely 3 years old. The doctors were just useless. They looked more frightened than any of us, and they kept whispering among themselves. There seemed just nothing they could do, and hours went by until they had given up all hope. It was getting late, and I was persuaded to go to my rooms. Alicky then sent a message to Rasputin in St. Petersburg. He reached the palace about midnight, or even later. By that time I had gone to my rooms, and early in the morning Alicky called me to go to Alexis's room. I just could not believe my eyes. The little boy was not just alive, but well. He was sitting up in bed, the fever gone, the eyes clear and bright, not a sign of any swelling on his leg. The horror of the evening before became an incredibly distant nightmare. Later I learned from Alicky that Rasputin had not even touched the child, but merely stood at the foot of the bed and prayed, and of course some people would at once have it that Rasputin's prayers were simply coincidental with my nephew's recovery. In the first place, any doctor would tell you that an attack of such severity cannot be cured within a bare few hours. Secondly, the coincidence might have answered if it happened, say once or twice, but I could not even count how many times it happened. I heard from Professor Fyodorov that it proved the very worst attack in the boy's life in the autumn of 1913. His mother wired to Pokrovskoye for help. Rasputin replied, "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Be anxious no longer. Your son will recover." Within an hour, my nephew was out of danger. Later that year, I met Professor Fyodorov, who told me that the recovery was wholly inexplicable from a medical point of view. Now, I have heard it said that the public might have understood Rasputin's position better had they known about my nephew's illness. That is pure calumny. It is true, his illness was not, as it were, broadcast as soon as Nicky and Alicky knew it, but it could not be kept a secret for long. They all blamed my poor sister in law for having transmitted the disease to her son, and then they blamed her for trying all she could to find a remedy. Was that just? Never did either my brother or Alicky believe that the man was endowed with any supernatural powers. They saw him as a peasant whose deep faith turned him into an instrument for God to use, but only in the case of Alexis. Alicky suffered terribly from neuralgia and sciatica, but I never heard that the Siberic helped her. I was away nursing at the front during that time, but I couldn't help hearing a lot. In the first place, knowing Nicky as I did, I must insist that Rasputin had not a particle of influence over him. It was Nicky who eventually put a stop to Rasputin's visits to the palace. It was again Nicky who sent the man back to Siberia, and that more than once. And some of Nicky's letters to Alicky are proof enough of what he really thought of Rasputin's advice. Things were going from bad to worse at the time Nicky was at Mogilev and Alicky all by herself at Tsarskoye Selo in 1914. I admit her letters do indicate she was paying more and more attention to Rasputin's advice. But don't forget that she saw him as her son's savior. Harassed almost beyond all endurance, unable to find support anywhere else, she ended by imagining the man to be the country's savior. But Nicky never shared that idea of Alicky's. For all his devotion, he dismissed and appointed men against her wishes. Sukhomlinov was replaced by Polovanov at the War Ministry after the Empress implored him not to do it, and Nicky dismissed Sturmer from the Foreign Office and sent Samarin to the Holy Synod, again acting on his own initiative. Then again, some people were only too ready to remember that Rasputin had been dead against us, fighting Germany in 1914. So in 1916, it was found convenient to start a campaign of the grossest calumnies against Alicky, that she was all for a separate peace with Germany, urged by Rasputin, who now, so they said, was just a tool in the hands of the Germans. This rubbish has now been disproved, but what untold harm it did at the time. I, having been so close to them both, never interfered either with advice or criticism. I knew little or nothing of purely political matters, and the rest was their own affair. But look at the family. My mother and Aunt Ella alone had Nicky's interests really at heart, but neither my mother nor my aunt knew all the details as they were. They, too, had based their judgments on rumors, yet at least they were quite sincerely anxious. All the others began coming to Tsarskoye Selo to give uncalled-for advice, to utter violently worded warnings, even to make scenes. Some even thought that Alicky should be sent to a convent. Nicky's young cousin Dmitri, whom you can learn about on this channel, with some friends of his, gave full support to a vile conspiracy. There was just nothing heroic about Rasputin's murder. Remember what Trotsky said about it, that it was carried out in the manner of a scenario designed for people of bad taste. You could hardly call Trotsky a champion of the monarchy. I think that for once the communists were not severe enough in their judgment. It was a murder premeditated most vilely. Just think of the two names most closely associated with it even to this day: a Grand Duke, one of the grandsons of the Tsar Liberator, and then a scion of one of our great houses, the Yusupovs, whose wife was a Grand Duke's daughter. That proved how low we had fallen. What did they hope to achieve? Did they really believe the killing of Rasputin would mend our fortunes at the front and bring it to an end the appalling transport chaos and all the resultant shortages? I've never for a moment believed it. The murder was so staged as to present Rasputin in the guise of a devil incarnate, and his killers as some fairy tale heroes. That foul murder was the greatest disservice to the one man they had sworn to serve. I mean Nicky. The involvement of two members of the family did nothing but reveal the appalling decadence in the upper social strata. It did more. It created panic among the peasants. Rasputin was flesh of their flesh and bone of their bone. They felt proud when they heard of him being the Tsarina's friend. When they heard of his murder, they said, "There, let one of us get near the Tsar and the Tsarina, and princess and counts must needs kill him out of jealousy. It is always they who will stand between the Tsar and ourselves." One cannot forget the artwork that Grand Duchess Olga created. She was a skilled painter and watercolorist, and hundreds of her paintings have been auctioned in both Russia and the United States. She also gave the paintings as gifts and loved painting out of doors. The vast landscapes of Russia and Canada inspired her work, as did her childhood. Even when she was dying above a beauty salon in East Toronto, Canada, with the British, Danish, and American embassies aware of her, but terrified to piss off Bolshevik Soviet Russia by extending friendship, she was asked if she was a princess. No, she answered, I am a Grand Duchess of Russia.